So, I'm going to be talking about applying fraud detection techniques to hunt adversaries. And just to introduce the topic a little bit more, I am going to be discussing a lot about financial crimes and the life of a fraud analyst. But first and foremost, this is going to be a hunting story. So if you're interested in threat hunting or you're interested in a different kind of threat hunting story than you're used to, definitely stick around. So a little more about my background. Like I said, I am currently a threat research analyst at Shadowscape, and I have been in the field for about 2 years, and I am a senior in college getting my bachelor's in information technology. Like we spoke about earlier, I was a fraud analyst before moving into information security, and I do CrossFit, and I love being outdoors, kayaking, and spending time with my kids. So just to go over the agenda, I'm going to give a little bit more background on financial crimes and fraud detection, and then we're going to talk about a hunting story. And then I'm going to apply some of the methodologies to the cyber domain. And just to note, if I talk about Carol, I have assigned the adversary in my story. Her name will be Carol, um, but is a hypothetical name. It is not the actual name of the individual. So there's a lot of different types of financial
So no,
crimes that,
no Carols were harmed in the making of this presentation?
yeah,
Okay.
that name is completely hypothetical and has no relation to anything. But okay, so there's a lot of different types of financial crime that fraud analysts are responsible for identifying. And credit card fraud typically takes place with skimmers, usually found on gas station pumps, or a lot of times people will steal card numbers from POS systems and they either print their own fraudulent cards or they sell them on the dark web. Check fraud could be anywhere from stealing checks, forging a signature on a check, to printing your own checks, and also like check kiting, which we're going to get into a little bit more. Money laundering happens when you try to clean dirty money, where you take money that was obtained illegally and you try to make it seem like it has a legal origin. Terrorist funding is pretty straightforward. Anytime you fund a terrorist organization, it's considered a crime and a fraudulent act, and that's something that we had to look out for. Embezzlement is when someone is placed in a position of trust within an organization to handle funds of the employer, such as someone in accounting or anyone who has access that misuses those funds or steals funds. Those are the types of things that we looked for. I primarily focused on check fraud. It was one of the most common uh, forms of fraud that we saw in my department. So going into talking about check fraud, there's something that I want everyone to understand. A lot of people don't understand the path that a check takes after you deposit it and why some institutions may put a hold on a check. So I don't know about you, but every year on Christmas when I was little, my grandma used to get me a check and she'd put it in my stocking and it was for $5. So in this scenario, I would be the payee as the receiver of the check and my grandma would be the payer. I would deposit the check into my bank. My bank would process the check and send it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve would then process the check and send it to the payer's bank, which would be my grandma, and see if she has the $5 in her account. And then the funds would be sent back through the Federal Reserve back into my account. In the event she doesn't have the funds available, they would send that message through the Federal Reserve back to my bank. And that time period is known as the float. And a lot of adversaries take advantage of the float, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, but I wanted to make sure you kind of understand uh, the float, because this is why if you've ever put like a large check on deposit it into your account, the bank might place it on hold because of the float. They want to make sure that the other bank has enough funds to cover the check to not only protect you, but also the financial institution to avoid loss. So my department, I worked for a smaller financial institution, and my department was very understaffed for the amount of workload that we had. We didn't have a lot of resources as far as tools. A lot of stuff that we did was very manual. There was not a lot of automation. Half the day I spent reviewing hundreds of check deposits. Every check that was deposited into the institution had to be manually reviewed. The reason the fraud department did it is because it allowed us to be down in the weeds and identifying the fraud as it's taking place to put a stop to it. The second half of my day was reviewing potential fraud alerts, and both of these are very similar. Manually looking at checks, thousands of checks every day is very daunting, and you have to make sure, is this a real check? Is this a fraudulent check? Is there a forged signature? Um, all of those things. Or should I put the check on hold, if they don't have the funds to cover the check? It can lead to a lot of alert fatigue. You want to have that same due diligence going into reviewing the fraud alerts that you did with all the checks. And when we really find a true threat event, it's exciting. It's exhilarating because it feels like you're actually getting the chance to do the job that you were trained to do. When you're chasing false positives and validating false positives, it can be defeating because you know that there's fraud going on. You've seen it, you know how they're doing it, but you have to follow the processes that are in place. So I decided to change it up. So the first thing I did is I took a look at our current tool set. I was a little bit more technical than the other people in my team. And I knew there was probably some features that I hadn't been looking at. There's some tabs on the software. So the first tool that I saw had already been enabled, that I don't think maybe I wasn't trained on it, or maybe they weren't aware that it had already been turned on. But it utilized machine learning to try to understand some form of normalcy of people's account activity, and it tried to create a baseline. The issue with that is people fluctuate their spending habits month to month. And so sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. We started reviewing a lot of the alerts that came through, and it definitely increased our workload because we had even more alerts to go through, but it also increased our false positives. It had value because we were able to, view fraud activity that we weren't viewing before or identify, but I knew our focus was still too broad and I wanted to narrow it down. So we decided to focus on just one single financial crime that we're very familiar with, that happened very often, that we thought would probably be the most easy to identify. So we created a hypothesis to drive our hunt, and the hypothesis, was we think there's someone check kiting or multiple people check kiting in our environment. So bringing Carol into the story to describe what check kiting is. Let's say Carol has a bank account, two bank accounts, both have $0. She writes a check for $200 from bank account A. She deposits it into the bank through the ATM at bank account B, creating or making the balance now $200. She immediately takes the cash out and she gets away with the money. The reason she's able to do that is because the Expedited Funds Availability Act, which was enacted in 1987, regulates that banks have to make the first $200 of checks available the next day for cash withdrawal and check clearing. And adversaries take advantage of that. So most of the time when you see a check kiting incident, it's typically in $200 increments. And they typically take the money out right away, and they take advantage of that float that we talked about. Before Bank A knows that Bank B doesn't have the money, she's already gone with the cash. And it can get really complicated when there's several banks and several people involved. One of the greatest examples of this, if you've ever seen the movie Catch Me If You Can with Leonardo DiCaprio, it's a true story about a master of deception. His name was Frank Abagnale Jr. He was a real guy, and he started as a teenager check kiting. Then he started printing his own checks. Then he started creating identities to go with his checks. So if you haven't seen it or you haven't read about him, I highly recommend it. So I wanted to start documenting what we knew. We knew that that Carol is using the ATM most of the time. We knew she was going to be doing it in $200 increments. We knew, there's certain policies and regulations, such as the Expedited Funds Availability Act that she's taking advantage of to get away with it, to evade detection. And so we started documenting all this, but then I started thinking, how would I do it? How would I do it with my knowledge of the inner workings of my organization? How could I commit this crime and get away with it? And I started acting my coworkers that, and they said, well, yeah, I mean, I would do it that way, but Carol's not going to know that because she doesn't know about this policy and that policy. But then I realized, what if someone does have that knowledge? What if it's a previous employee? What if it's a current employee? So I really make sure I stress that it's just as important to not only ask yourself how you would do it with your knowledge, but then also ask yourself, what would Carol do? How would she do it? How has she been doing it? When we started looking at previous incidents for any clues or common characteristics that we can use during the hunt. And so we collected all the characteristics. We found there was a specific age group that was most popular for this type of activity. There was the accounts that were involved were newer accounts, and then obviously the previous examples, the $200 increments, the ATM activity. And so the results were astounding. I mean, we were able to identify numerous amounts of check kiting events, and it almost felt too easy. Like it felt like we should have been able to identify this activity previously. I mean, we had all this information. We just needed to organize it into this process that led us, to all of this good data that it would have taken us a really long time to find previous. So we have all the information, and we decided to analyze each person individually. So we made like Excel spreadsheets on each individual person. We analyzed their check activity, their ATM activity, who they were writing checks to, and I tried to focus on any behaviors leading up to the incident that we were able to find in our hunt. Was there any prior attempts? A lot of them ended up being repeat offenders. And then I also wanted to see, was there any red flags that could have led to earlier detection? And so as we started creating, this all of these spreadsheets, I needed to see them all connected. So I created a mind map. I personally like visualizing my data to be able to view all of the connections to make sure I'm not missing anything. We soon found out Carol was right at the middle. She was the one leading the fraud ring, and there is a lot of data visualization tools, but we were thick in the hunt. Like I didn't want to lose traction, so we were literally just writing it out on paper with a pen. But this one is very similar to the one that we ended up using. So after we analyzed all of the data, we made all the connections, we were able to identify a fraud ring of about 35 people, with Carol is the one that was the leader. We were able to identify how her techniques evolved over time and how she became more sophisticated and how she learned about our inner workings and what worked and what didn't work. She started with fake checks, and then she started with temporary checks, and then she moved on to her own checks and using other people. And it was just really interesting to see how she progressed over time. And we were able to pass that information on to the authorities, and we were able to identify that we weren't the only victim. There were other financial institutions that had been burned by the same group of people. And I realized, had we had some line of communication with them, we would have been able to see, or, we would have been able to have those names and look for that specific type of activity to prevent, further loss for the company and identify it sooner. So when I moved into cybersecurity, I realized a lot of the techniques that I learned, a lot of the methodologies can be applied to the cyber domain. Being familiar with your environment when you're trying to have a more proactive approach to security with a threat hunting, you really want to know your environment. You want to identify your assets. You want to map your network. You want to know the path that they're going to take. It really, it goes into, cultivating an adversarial mindset. With financial fraud, it's easy. Their motive is always going to be financial gain. But in cyber domain, it's not always going to be financial gain. There's, a whole bunch of different motives that it could be, but typically there is some asset that they're trying to get a hold of, and mapping your network really helps with that. And then, like I said earlier, you you really want to make sure you don't forget your own knowledge, because it could be an insider. You could identify someone that's currently working within your organization with your, same knowledge committing, a cyber attack. And then also, what is Carol doing? What's Carol been doing? What is she doing in the wild? You got to keep up on Karen's shenanigans. You want to keep that updated adversary profile. And then the processes and documentation, really keep everything organized. You don't want to just go willy-nilly looking for APT 28 and think they're hiding under a rock somewhere in your network. You really want to, focus in, you know, start small, try to look for known indicators of compromise. And um, you have to understand that a single indicator of compromise that you were able to identify is only a small tentacle of a larger campaign. And without the processes and documentation and the human driven analysis, you're not going to be able to find what all the tentacles of the campaign, what everything means, what it's connected to, what's the motive. You want to find out all that information so you can put a stop to it. And then the post-incident activities, I personally think there's just so much data in previous incidents, really analyzing behaviors leading up to incidents to not only, look for things that could indicate a red flag or anything that could lead to earlier detection, but also just to see, the types of techniques that are being used in your environment. That information is just a gold mine, in my opinion. And then, I think my story is a great example of how automation is an aid, but it shouldn't be relied upon. There is a lot of uh, analysis that should be human driven. When we were deep in the hunt, we started thinking laterally and we started analyzing different people and who they're connected to, and let me see all the checks that person has ever written and who are they writing them to. And that's just something that I believe computers can't do. And then visualize your data. Visualizing it is really going to allow you to make connections and correlations, not only between indicators of compromise, but between adversaries. You might be able to find there's more than one person involved. There might be more than one adversary. This might be a group of people. And the threat information sharing, if we would have had that in place specifically for fraud information sharing, it's possible we could have prevented the organization from losing a lot of money, and we could have not only prevented it or at least detected it earlier. So I wanted to make this actionable for anyone that's thinking about getting into threat hunting, or I know this is a lot to look at, so I'm going to make all my slides available for download, but I wanted to at least get anyone who's thinking about getting into threat hunting some actionable items for things that I've used. So in conclusion, I really wanted to shine light with this presentation on how similar the two fields are with fraud detection and information security. And I think the two fields can really learn from each other and should learn from each other because of how similar they are. And, both, kinds of analysts deal with a lot of the same issues like alert fatigue and false positives and wanting to do the job that they were trained to do. And trying not to get defeated, chasing all these false positives. So, when we decided to narrow our focus and just, change things up, and thankfully I was in a team that didn't have static leadership, that was open to, innovative new ideas, and they were able to see the, results from it. And so it ended up being implemented, and it was very successful moving forward. And I was very excited to be a part of that, in making any process more streamlined. So I hope that it can inspire anyone else that is thinking about getting into threat hunting, or I hope it was a great story for anyone that's currently in threat hunting, and to show how similar the fields are. So thank you so much for watching.
Very nicely done. Um, got a couple comments. Let's see here. So Carol is the primary name that's used to make fraud, right? I mean, this is what I'm taking
She's
away.
the adversary of the story, yes.
So $200 increments. I didn't. I always wondered about why I could always get a certain amount of money out of an ATM. I didn't realize that the Expedited Funds Availability Act mandated that $200 be available. I'm grateful for it, but man, that does create quite a hole.
Yeah, and,
Um,
and that it's surprising how like in cybersecurity, there's certain things you could just shut down, but in fraud, you can't change government acts and regulations, so you have to just work with them.
so in hunting, you have to think like an attacker. Which means you have to understand the constraints and the goals and the methods, which helps if you do attack stuff. So that putting your mind into that mindset it's a really cool thing. So you made Excel spreadsheets for each of these different people,
Yes.
and you looked for behaviors that you knew would be a trigger. You started analyzing to see if there were repeat offenders, other red flag. So you were training your internal intrusion detection routines based on thinking about the problem, thinking about who is doing this, how they have to operate, what they're using, what the likelihood indicators are. You may have a job with the FBI if this whole threat hunting thing doesn't work out.
Yeah.
But
Thanks.
thinking, using analytics and data is nice, but thinking about what you're looking for, being proactive, putting yourself past
Hmm.
what the typical state of the art is. That's awesome. Really good stuff. Thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I didn't want to lose any connection, by,
So
reviewing every check deposited by every person. It really, and even the checks that don't, every check that got bounced and didn't actually make it. That's all important data that I wanted to make sure I captured.
I liked your list a lot. I thought that it was a really cohesive list of things. Know your environment, adversarial mindset, and so on. I really loved the document all the things because, well, that's a thing and it's humorous too.
Yeah, and if you're working with law enforcement, it really helps them out too because you've already done most of the legwork of who's connected to who and what day and all that information. The more detailed as possible. So document all the things.
Very cool. Going to a couple comments and questions. Apparently, Kevin on the line here says that he met Frank Abagnale at their local security conference. So that's pretty
Ooh,
cool.
that would be
I
pretty
didn't.
epic.
I mean, you think that it would make sense that he would be involved, but so many times that's just not the case. So that's really cool to see.
Yeah,
Um,
he ended up being an FBI informant.
and then Alexander says, amazing presentation, not a question. Smiley face. Anybody else with questions? Otherwise, we'll let Nicole go and just congratulate her. But
Thank you.
hey, you did a great job. I loved your slides. The visuals were very nice.
Thank
Is
you.
that a is that like your company mandates that, right? It's like you will be graded on how good your slides look. Because
Yeah.
I noticed that with Evil Bit too earlier. His slides were
Yeah.
really attractive to look at. Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you very much.